Welcome to JonGetsGames. Today I'll be reviewing Downforce. This game was designed by Wolfgang Kramer, and it's a racing game where players will first auction off every single car to see who controls which, and then they will evaluate the race using hand management, placing cards on the table which will move multiple cars around the track. They will of course try to move their own cars as fast as possible while jamming up their opponent's cars, and as the race goes on, there are several spots where you can bet on your cars or your opponent's cars so you can still make money even if your cars don't do that well. The winner is the person who gets the most money, not necessarily the person who crosses the finish line first. And it's worth noting that this game has been published in many different incarnations over the last 40 years. This is the most recent one that came out from Restoration Games, and I will first explain how the game plays in a little more detail, and then I'll jump into my review. The first thing players need to do when setting up Downforce is deciding which map to play. There is this more wide open version right here, and on the back we have a little bit of a more tight and curvy track on the back. We then randomly put all of the race cars onto the various positions at the start of the racetrack. It doesn't matter if we're playing with 2 players or 6, we always have 6 cars in play. Next, we take this deck of speed cards, we make sure to give it a good shuffle, and then we deal it all out to all of the players equally. And if you have any remainders left over, you can throw these into the box. We next take this special deck of 6 speed 8 cards. We go ahead and give those a shuffle, put it in the middle, and then you shuffle up all of these power cards as well. And now we're able to start the auction phase of the game. Now, before we can actually race, we need to figure out who owns which car, and that's where this comes into play. We flip over the top card of both of these stacks, and now we're going to be doing a one-shot auction for the black car, and the person who wins this auction will also get the ability associated with the car, which in this case would be Tricky. In order to bid in the auction, each player needs to grab one card from their hand, and the number on that card that matches the color of the car is going to dictate their bid in millions of dollars. So if I played this card down, it would be a $2 million bid, but if I picked this one over here, that would just be a $1 million bid. You'll notice that I only have 1s and 2s in my hand, so I can't actually bid more than that for this specific car. So let's go ahead and say that I picked this one, and we're all doing this simultaneously, choosing one card. Once we've all done this, we can flip over the cards and see what everyone bid. We put $2 million down, the left-hand player did $3 million, the top player bid $4 million, and the right-hand player also did $4 million. So in this case, we have a tie, but we now see who has the most of these rows on their card. Well, they both have 4 rows, so the second tie goes to the person who has a card with no wild on it. So that means that the top player in this example is going to be able to buy access to this black car. They're going to go ahead and take this token right here to show that they own the car. They get this card into their hand, so they can move the black car once very quickly, and they get this ability which says Tricky. On your turn, you may move your cars in reverse order from lowest to highest, and this kind of thing will make a little more sense once I explain how the actual race works. Each player starts the game with one of these sheets, and once they've won an auction like the top player just did, they then write the amount they spent. So in this case, it was 4 in line with the actual color car, so the top player would do that. That means they spent $4 million on this black car so that they can remember that going forward in the game. We'll now go ahead and flip the next 2 cards over and do another auction, and we're going to do this 6 times until every one of the cars has been purchased, and we do have to make sure that every single player owns at least 1 car. So if you ever have a situation where there is the exact number of cars left, 2 players without cars, then anybody who already owns a car cannot bid into a new auction. It's also worth noting that if you won multiple auctions, you will have multiple of these abilities, but before we actually race, you're going to have to pick one of these 2 and discard the rest. It's now time for us to start racing, and let's say, for example, we bought the yellow and the green cars. Well, we get to go first because the yellow car happens to be on the start player spot, and on a racing turn, all you do is select one card from your hand, play it down, and then move all of the cars on that card the set number of spaces forward, always starting at the top and going down. So, for instance, if we took this card right here, the first thing we do is move our yellow car 6 spaces forward. Next up, we would look down here and see that we have to move the blue car 4 spaces forward. And when you go forward, you either go this way or you can also go in the diagonal. And even though we don't control the blue car, we get to move it because it's on our card. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. And we are able to move this wherever we want to as long as it goes forward if there is a legal move. So if it was, for instance, looking like this, and this car was there, and this car was right there, I could make the blue car go 1, 2, and then it would stop moving because it no longer had any legal moves. But if it was right here, I'd be forced to move it forward. Now we have a wild on the card, and this just means we can move any color car as long as it's not already showing up on this card right here. So that means we can move the red or the green car, and we own the green car. So in this case, we'd probably move the green car 2 spaces forward, and lastly, of course, orange would move 1. It's of course important for everybody to remember the skill cards that they have in front of themselves. For instance, if we had this aggressive card, it says if we had played a card with our car on the top of the card, we would get an extra movement space. Well, this card right here has yellow on the top, so because of that special ability, our car would actually be here, and as you can see, we've actually gotten to a point where this is a choke point and no other cars can get through it, which is going to incentivize our opponents to actually move our car more farther forward so that they could get their cars around as well. This card is now permanently out of the game. We put it into a discard pile, and play now goes to the next person in clockwise order around the table. The next thing I'd like to point out are these 3 betting strips. Now, at the end of the turn where the lead car crosses over one of these, every single player will take out their sheet of paper and they will do a bet. For this first strip, it'll be bet 1, and then bet 2, and finally bet 3 over here. And all you're doing is taking out a pen and secretly marking down which car you think is going to cross the finish line first. It might not actually be your car, but in this case, maybe I'd say, well, I'm in the lead right now, yellow's doing pretty good, so I'll just mark that right there. And that means that at the end of the game, if yellow ends up being first, I'll end up getting $9 million for this bet. Play is going to keep going around the table as the cars race down the track, and each player is using 1 card per turn until at least 1 car crosses over this checkered line. As soon as they do that, they go into the topmost place section, and we're going to keep playing the game until every single car has either crossed the finish line or the player has spent all of the cards they have in their hand, and maybe the card doesn't even quite make it. With the race over, players can now reveal their sheets and calculate their final score. The first thing they're going to get is their racing total payout, and this is for how their cars did. We have the yellow and the green car, so if we look down here, we see for second and third place, that is 9 million and 6 million, so we could put 15 million in right there. Next, we have the betting total. If we look up here, we see we bet on the yellow car the first 2 bets, but then it looked like the red car was getting in the lead, so we bet on the red car. That means we're in second place for these 2 bets. That's 6 million plus 4 million is 10 million, and then we got 3 million for the accurate bet near the end of the race, so that's 13 million for the betting. And lastly, the auction total is negative points for us. We spent 7 million to get these 2 cars, so we put that down just like that. Now we add and subtract all this together to get our final score. In this example, our final score will be $21 million, and the player with the most money is going to win, and if there's a tie, then the person whose car finished higher up on the final racing payouts is going to be the person who wins the game. Let's now begin the review for Downforce by starting with a couple positive points. And the first of these relates to the hand management phase of the game and the decisions that you're making while you're trying to figure out what card you want to play on your turn. And realistically, this is the majority of the game. This is the actual evaluation of the race itself. And the cards you have in hand are a depleting resource. You might have some really great cards for the cars that you purchased in the auction. And that's probably why you actually went to go ahead and grab those cars in the auction, because you knew you could push them really far forward. But odds are good you also have cards that are great for your opponents, and you need to know the right moment to play all of these cards, although it is worth noting that you are not necessarily going to play all the cards in your hand. It depends on the player count. At the higher player counts, it's very likely that you will use all of your cards, and then you have that extra burdensome decision where you need to figure out the right moment to play that one card that does nothing for you and is great for your opponents. You want to play that card in a moment where it burns as many of the movements as possible so that those cars just don't move, and then also knowing the right moment to play that great card for your cars so that they can get into great spots on the board, maybe block things up for your opponents, or just get really far ahead, which is also really important in a racing game. I like the tempo of playing these cards out from your hand, because at the beginning of the game you have lots of cards. It's going to depend on the player count again if you have 7 or 14 cards in your hand, but you are figuring out which ones you're going to play at which times. And as the race goes on, this supply gets smaller and smaller, so the decisions get easier, I suppose, as the game goes on, which means you're not thinking as much near the late game, but the ramifications of the decisions that you made earlier in the game become very present at the later parts of the game. So I still think that that's pretty interesting in general, and yeah, I just enjoy the decision of figuring out what card to play for most of the turns that I played in the game. For positive number two, I'd like to briefly discuss the power cards that you can pull into your area through the auction. Now, you're only allowed to have one of these even if you win multiple auctions, and I think that is smart because these powers can be somewhat important as you're playing the game. And in general, I enjoy having asymmetries in games so that what I'm doing is slightly different than my opponents. And with these six power cards, they let you break rules, which is also a fun thing to do from an asymmetric perspective. It's not like, oh, your car starts one space forward. It's like, no, you can evaluate your card from the bottom to the top, whereas everybody else has to go from the top to the bottom. Or maybe as you're moving your car along, if it only goes on rectangular spots on the board, you get an extra couple of movements. Now, I enjoy the powers themselves and I like evaluating them, but I also like the decisions that they bring into the auction because, and I'll talk about the auction in a little bit, but it forces you to look at your hand of cards and decide, is that power going to work well with the hand of cards that I have for this specific race? Because some of them are a little bit more helpful than others. Like one of them says that you get extra movement if a card that you own is at the top level of the cards that you have in your hand. And that could be a really powerful ability or a really terrible one, depending on the cards you have in your hand and depending on the cards that you actually buy. So the potency of the powers is going to vary to a certain degree based off of how the auction actually goes for you. And for the most part, you have control over that. You know, you can bid higher for a power that's really good for you. But of course, when you bid high, you actually lose points. It is worth mentioning that there is one card that I feel like with the more open map feels a little bit more powerful than the others. You know, I haven't played the game enough to say that it's super imbalanced or anything, but the one where if you get two extra movements if you only move through rectangular spaces, it seems like with the open map there are a ton of rectangular spaces, and I in one game got like 12 or 13, or I guess it would be 12 or 14 or something like that, extra movements, and I did win that game, although just barely. But I guess that one is also situational because on the flip side of the board, there are much fewer of those rectangular spots. So in general, I do enjoy playing with these powers. I enjoy the decisions that come into play with actually grabbing them. And for the most part, they seem to be relatively equal to each other. Let's now move into a couple neutral points, and the first of these relates to the auction that you do at the beginning of the game. Now, I like the idea of this auction. I like that it forces players to analyze the cards they have in their hand to figure out what card they're going to do best with. I also like the way it forces them to think about the powers that come up and how those might interact with the hand of cards they have. I also like that it means that in many player counts, one person might have more cards than another person, but they have invested all these negative points into those cards, and they better make sure that they get more points out than the amount of points that they spent to actually get that car into their possession. But when I've actually evaluated the auction every single time, it's just felt clunky. There are a couple weird things about it. Like the first one is that you play a card down for the auction, and then you pull it right back into your hand. And that's kind of thrown everyone for a loop every time I've taught it. They just kind of assume that you would lose that card and you would not have access to it, which kind of makes sense because you're bidding a high number to go ahead and grab that card. But okay, you pull it back in your hand. That works. It's just not what I expected. And then the process of actually analyzing your hand varies drastically based on player count. In a 6-player game, you have 7 cards in your hand. In a 2-player game, you have 21 cards in your hand. And it kind of makes you go cross-eyed, like trying to look at all these cards. And on the one hand, you might just shoot from the hip and just be like, okay, well, I'll just bid on that and hope it works out well for me. Or on the other hand, you could really sit there and just analyze your hand and figure out what card is best. And that might take a while. And that's just a bit slow and clunky and not that interesting to me. So at the end of the day, when I've actually evaluated the auction, I've kind of always had a breath of relief once we've gotten through the auction. Like, okay, we got through that kind of extended, clunky setup. Now let's actually race the game. This is what I sat down at the table to actually do. And I'm glad that the auction exists. It serves a purpose, and I don't think it's broken. I just wish it was more fun for me. For neutral number 2, let's discuss the amount of player interaction in the game. And as I've already mentioned, I enjoy the act of pushing my opponent's cards into corners so that they can't really move. I enjoy placing cards down that burn the action points and movement points of my opponent's cards so that they don't get those extra benefits. But it does get to the point where it can be frustrating in this game. And there have been a couple times where I've seen it with other players. And in fact, one game where I got super frustrated while I was playing it, I only controlled one car, and for at least a third of the game, my car did not move. I just kept having a turn. I'd play a card, it would just burn everything, and my car was jammed up behind like 3 other cars. And I think part of that has to do with playing the wrong map for the player count, and I'm going to talk about that pretty soon in the review. But I will state that while I enjoy the interaction in this game, and I feel like you do need jostling and blocking when it comes to a racing game like this, it can sometimes be a little bit more than I like and lead to frustration for me and some of the people I've played with around the table. it's now time for us to jump into a couple negative points to the game. And I was just talking about this in the last neutral point, so let's go into the player boards and player counts. Now, the rules state that there are these two boards that you can play with. You just flip the entire map over, and I love having variety like that. And one of these maps is much more open than the other one. And I have found that they do not necessarily play well at all player counts. And I really wish that the game had come published with player count recommendations, or even just a mandate to say that with that really congested map, you do not play that game with more than 4 players, or maybe even more than 3 players. Because when I played that at 5 players, it almost broke the game. There was so much blocking going on that map. But when I played the really wide open map at a 3-player setting, it almost felt like there was no blocking. It was just too wide open and we could just all do everything we wanted to. So I feel like on the tight map, it should say 2 to 3 players and 4 maybe, and then you flip it over and then you have a 4 maybe, and then 5 and 6 player map. And I guess that's kind of like nitpicking, because this isn't an issue with the actual mechanics. It's just a recommendation I feel like the rules should have had, but you should definitely know this going into the game, that there are player counts that just don't work with some of these maps, and I think that should have been a little bit more visible for players when they sit down to play the game for the first time. For negative number 2, I want to discuss the betting mechanic in the game. Now, this is probably my biggest disappointment for the whole game, because I really like the idea of this, where it doesn't matter if your cars are not doing great in the race, you can bet on your opponent's cars that they will do well, and then you will get points because they did well because you bet correctly. And, well, on one hand, first of all, it's more of a guess than a bet because you're not actually wagering any points. I guess the loss condition for that bet is that you got less points than you could have if you had guessed a different car. But the main issue that I've had with it is it's always turned into a self-fulfilling prophecy. In every game I've played so far, the car that is farthest ahead when it crosses that first betting line has had everybody bet for that car, except I think for one instance where one player bet for a different car that was just a couple spaces behind, I think because they owned it. But then what happens is everybody feels like they will do okay if they get points for that car, and so they're like, well, if I have to push this car or that car, I may as well push that car because I'm going to get more points if I push it. And that car has always won. And in fact, at the end of every single game, we've seen that everybody just guessed for the same car all the way down, except for that one person who ended up changing their guess for the second bet and then went with a third one that matched everybody else around the table. So that means when the game has ended every time, it's kind of like, okay, well, everybody gets 18 million points, and now let's talk about how your specific cars did, and then how much you put into the auction to figure out who's actually going to win the game. And I'm not really sure why this has happened. It's a possibility that this is groupthink for the people that I played it. I've played multiple games with a large variety of different people, and the first time it happened, I thought, okay, that's just a fluke. Like, that one car was super far ahead for the first bet, and it just kind of made sense that it would stay in the lead. But when it happened game after game, it started to feel like a problem for me, and unfortunately, it puts a lot more emphasis on you actually winning the game if everybody is getting essentially the same amount of points for the betting that they did. Let's now discuss the variability for Downforce, and I think that it's pretty much what I expected going in. There are 2 different maps, which I think is somewhat standard for racing style games, where you have a variety of different ways that you can play the game, although I think that variability is taken down a little bit considering what I talked about earlier, where at certain player counts, certain maps just don't feel like they work at all, so it almost feels like they're more tied to the specific player counts, so the variability suffers a little bit there. But you also have those 6 power cards, which definitely play differently from one another and will spice up one game to the next. So I think when you add all these together, it's about what I expected in a racing style game. Downforce plays 2 to 6 players, and I've played the 2, 3, and 5 player versions of the game, and I think that even though I haven't played to 6 players, I think it's likely that that will be the best way to play, although 5 also worked very well, but all of this has a caveat of you really need to play the right track for all of these different counts. In the 5-player game I did, it didn't work so well because I was on the really tight map, but I feel like if it had been on the much more open map, it would have been a much more competitive experience, and it is kind of interesting having at least one player own 2 cars, and you're not going to have that in the 6-player experience, but at 6, everybody is just out for themselves. It's going to streamline the auction process much more as well, and I think this game just wants lots of players. And I'll be honest, I did not like my 2-player game of this at all. One of us had 4 cars, the other one had 2. I was the person who had the 2 cars, and we played on the tighter map, which is probably, again, better for 2 than the more open map would be. and I won with 2 cards versus 4 cards, which was kind of interesting to see, but it just did not feel that engaging. I feel like there were not enough people around the table to jostle with. There's just my cars and my opponent's cars, and that's just kind of the way it was, so there wasn't even much blocking, even on the tighter map. So, yeah, I think just the more people you can get around the table for this game, the better. It's unfortunate that I didn't really like it at all at 2 players, but I think most people don't go into racing games to strictly play it in a 2-player perspective, so it's not that big of a deal. In conclusion, I've played Downforce 3 times at this point, and in general, I've had a good time with it. I will admit that I am a bit disappointed by the betting mechanism just not really working out for us, especially when you consider your final score is how much you spent on your auction as a reduction in your points, how your cars do in the race, and then how the bets go. When you take out one of those 3 legs to your tripod, it really hyper focuses on the auction and the way your cars do, and I do miss the betting mechanic not really working out as much as I'd like to. And as I mentioned before, this could just be groupthink for us and the people I played with. Maybe for other groups, they will bet all over the place, and that does become varied. But if it happened to my group, it could happen to your group. So I'm not really sure how that one's going to shake out. Um, I did admit that I thought 2-player was pretty weak with this game, but even the 3-player game was twice as good as that 2-player game was. And I like that this is a game that plays well with a bunch of people around the table. As I mentioned before, I think 5 and especially 6 is probably the best way that you're going to be playing this game, and not a lot of games do that very well. And it seems like, especially once you get into the mid stages of the race, turns go relatively quickly as you figure out which card to play, you put it down, it might not be your turn, but it's fun seeing your cars move sometimes, unless you fall into that situation where your car gets crazy blocked because you are playing a map that you probably shouldn't be based on the player count, as I mentioned before. So there were just a few things that kind of tripped me up as I was playing the game, but in the end, I enjoyed all 3 of my plays. Even that 2-player game that I feel like did not work very well, I still had fun with it. It just didn't necessarily blow me away. So that's kind of where I end up with Downforce. I think it's a decent game. I've had an okay time playing with it, and I think if the main hand management race evaluation part sounds interesting to you, it's likely you'll enjoy it too. As always, I'd like to thank everyone who's been supporting my channel through Patreon, including all of these producer-level pledges. If you too would like to directly support the channel, you could do so at patreon.com/JonGetsGames, and I'd really appreciate it. Also, if you'd like to see more in-depth board game reviews like this one, as well as full game playthroughs and vlogs, please subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.